I'd like to get started and welcome everyone coming into the webinar today. Our topic and prompt and theme for inviting our distinguished guests today is What Next for Germany, a preview of the 2021 election, which will be happening this Sunday. And our guests and speakers are going to comment not just on the elections, but on the moment of political, economic, social, technological, environmental politics in Germany, and some of the larger context of what policies and stakes and systems are in process and at work in the election coming up this weekend. My name is Kaija Schilde. I'm an associate professor of international relations at the BU Pardee School of Global Studies. And this year I'm the acting director of the Center for the Study of Europe, which is hosting this event. We have a number of other fascinating events this year. And so please look at our website for the rest of our schedule coming up. So to turn to the speakers today, we are delighted to be hosting the Consul General of Germany to New England, Nicole Menzenbach. She will be our first speaker. And then we also are welcoming Professor Sabine von Mering, the director of the Center for German and European Studies at Brandeis University. Also, we are welcoming today two John F. Kennedy Memorial Fellows and visiting scholars at Harvard's Center for European Studies. They are Dr. Charlotte Bartels, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the German Institute for Economic Research, and Pascal König, who is a researcher at the Technical University of Kaiserslautern. And then lastly, I welcome, last but not least, two of my Pardee School colleagues, Professor Thomas Berger and Professor Vivian Schmidt. So Consul General Menzenbach, would you like to start?
Thank you so much, Kaija. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me and including me in this today's distinguished roundtable. So as you said, the federal elections for Germany, for the German Bundestag, will be held in 2 days from now. And even though Angela Merkel will remain in office until the new government is formed, an era is coming to an end. In this respect, we can speak of an historic election. Angela Merkel has shaped Germany for 16 years, 4 legislative periods, 4 government coalitions. Angela Merkel has worked with 4 US presidents, so President Bush, Obama, Trump, and now President Biden. She has also worked on the European stage closely with 4 French presidents, Chirac, Sarkozy, Hollande, and now President Macron. As you all know, Angela Merkel is not seeking for another term as Chancellor. She has become an anchor of stability in German politics and a central figure in European politics and global affairs. So the big question is, who will succeed her? There are 3 candidates for Chancellor. Olaf Scholz, he's from the Social Democrats Party, Armin Laschet from the Christian Democrats, and Annalena Baerberg from the Green Party. So Armin Laschet is the premier, so it's more or less an equivalent to an US governor of North Rhine-Westphalia, so the most popular state in Germany. He's a close political friend of Angela Merkel. He has always supported her, especially during the refugee crisis, when he stood firmly by her side. Annalena Baerberg, she and Robert Habeck are co-leaders of the Green Party, but it has been agreed that she would serve as Chancellor. Being only 40 years old, she would belong to the new generation of political leaders. Last but not least, Olaf Scholz, he's the current finance minister and vice chancellor. He's a social democrat, the SPD, the oldest party in Germany. And according to recent polls, 47% of the Germans want Olaf Scholz as chancellor. This election campaign was dominated by 3 main issues: climate change, economic justice, and affordable housing. And similar to the US election unfolded last year, Foreign policy played only a minor role during the campaign, mostly because in the area of foreign policy, the strongest party differed only in nuances and in some priorities. According to yesterday's polls, the Social Democrats are at 25%, so the leading party. The Christian Democrats at 23%, the Green Party at around 16.5%, the FDP, the Liberals, at 12%, the AfD, the very far-right party, at 10%, and the Linke, the left party, at 6%. Surprisingly, only 2 days before the election, up to 1/3 of all voters in Germany are still undecided. I rarely seen so much movement in the polls as in the past few weeks. So it's not yet clear now who will be the strongest party. And we are all very eager to see the first results, which we will be receiving on Sunday at 12 o'clock noon local time. So right now, anything seems possible. So before I talk a little bit more why this election matters so much, I would briefly like to discuss the electoral system, because it's really very different from the US system. So Germany has a very complex voting system for electing its Bundestag, which seeks to combine the benefits of both the direct and the proportional representation. Learning from our history, it also guards against political fragmentation that we have experienced in the Weimar Republic. When Germans head to the polls on Sunday, they each have 2 votes, one for their local candidate and the other one for the political party. The candidate who received the most votes in one of Germany's 299 electoral districts will represent his or her constituency in the parliament. However, the German parliament has 598 seats, so the remaining seats are filled proportionally according to the results of the second vote, where voters vote for a political party. A party is also only represented in the parliament if it wins at least 5% of the second vote. This hurdle was put in place to prevent political fragmentations and parties splintering into smaller and smaller fractions, as Germany experienced in the 1920s and in the early 1930s. So unlike the presidential system in the US, voters in Germany do not directly elect the Chancellor, who is the head of the government. After the results are in, the top candidate from the party that wins the most votes usually manage to form a coalition. Once a coalition is formed, the members of the parliament who belong to the coalition government elect the new chancellor by simple majority. If current trends hold on, the next government, for the first time in history, in German history, will include 3 instead of 2 parties. So why does this election matter so much? Germany is the fourth largest economy in the world and the largest economy in Europe. What happens in Germany will have significant impact on the European stage as well as on the global stage. However, the 3 largest parties have, as I said, very similar outlook on big foreign policy questions. All 3 parties and the candidates for Chancellor consider the United States to be our most important ally outside Europe. All 3 consider NATO as a key pillar of German defense posture. And all 3 favor close European cooperation. I think there is one policy area that is politically promising for the transatlantic cooperation, protecting our climate and our environment. When Europe put together its big COVID recovery package of 1.8 trillion euro, 30% was committed to a green transformation of our economies. And I believe there's a real potential for the United States and Europe as the two largest blocs of advanced democracies in the world to create a regulatory framework that can lead the world in the fight against climate change. Together, we have the intellectual capacity, the funds, and the political capital to address the most pressing challenge of our times. Before I conclude, I would like to say something about Merkel's legacy. So Merkel is a woman of superlatives. She's the first CDU chairwoman. CDU is her party, the first CDU chairwoman, first female chancellor, first East German in the most powerful office of a reunited Germany, and the longest service head of government in the European Union. Lastly, she will be the first chancellor who is leaving power on their own terms. Every single of her predecessors were replaced by the party or voted out of power. The major issues that have determined her years in office are prosperity and security, climate change, the nuclear phase out and the coal phase out, Germany's role in a changed world order, and various crises. Chancellor Angela Merkel guided Germany through 4 crises. The first one was the financial crisis in 2008, when the Lehman Brothers investment bank in New York collapsed with catastrophic consequences for the financial industry over the world. Angela Merkel assured the Germans that their deposit was safe and presented a 418 billion euro plan for the banks, and Germany has come out of this crisis comparatively well. The second, the euro crisis in 2009, and I believe this was especially the euro crisis that was a defining moment of Angela Merkel's chancellorship. It was about keeping Europe together and the central role that Germany plays in Europe. In 2010, she said what has become one of her signatures, quote, she said, if the euro fails, the euro, the currency, if the euro fails, Europe fails. And this sentence sums up her political belief as a strong proponent of a united Europe. The next crisis took place in 2015, where more than 1 million refugees from Syria and other countries arrived in Germany, and where various European countries started to close their borders. Merkel made the decision to leave the German borders open to the refugees. And another signature quote of that time was, "Wir schaffen das, we can do it." She was celebrated and admired for this political position on the global stage. However, in Germany, although the vast majority supported her, there were many people who were absolutely against her migration policy. And during this time, the AfD established itself as a political party and entered the German Bundestag, the German parliament, in 2017. And the worst came at the end, the coronavirus pandemic, which we are still in the middle of. Here, I think Angela Merkel's background as a scientist was very helpful. And in this context, it is important for me to mention that as the chair of the German EU presidency in 2020, Merkel has launched, together with the European Commission, a 715 billion rescue package, so the next generation EU, and which includes both loans and grants. So to conclude and to reiterate what I said at the beginning of my remarks, this is a historic election. We are witnessing a central element of democracy at work, the peaceful transfer of power. And as political observers, we know how important this is for the democratic process. Angela Merkel has recognized that her time has come to an end, And last week, she said, I've done my part, now it's the turn of the others. And on Sunday, we will find out who exactly these others will be. So we are very excited. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. That was a perfect introduction to our panel, the bigger picture and putting decades of the significance of German politics in context. So next speaker is Charlotte Bartels. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I will briefly now summarize the idea of the potential coalition partners with respect to social policies and taxations as they are laid out in their election programs. So when laying out their election programs, parties aim to distinguish themselves, but at the same time, their plans also signal to potential partners that they are open to working together. So as Nicole already said, whoever comes out ahead on Sunday, Germany is likely to end up with a three-way coalition. So either we'll have the conservative CDU party and the Liberal party and the Greens come together, or the Social Democratic Party, the Greens, and the left. So compared to the elections of the previous decade, where we had a grand coalition of Social Democrats and Conservative Party eventually formed, there is now the chance of a significant shift in German politics, either to more liberal policies or to more social democratic policies after the elections. As in the United States, taxing the rich and housing were very controversially debated topics in this election campaign. But also the strengthening of the German minimum wage that was first introduced in 2015 generated substantial controversy between the parties. And then last but certainly not least, pensions are an important topic, given that almost 40% of the German electorate is older than 60 years. So broadly speaking, the Conservative Party and the Liberals have promised to cut taxes in several domains. Both parties plan to abolish the so-called solidarity surcharge that was introduced after reunification to cover the costs of reunification temporarily. And this move is expected to primarily benefit higher income earners. And the Conservatives also plan to cut corporate income tax from 15% to 10%. But one should add that basically all parties want to ease the tax burden for low and medium income earners. But estimations from the Center for the European Economic Research, the ZEW, show that these tax plans turn out to feature quite differently across the income distribution. So interestingly, while all parties' plans to reduce income taxes will definitely benefit low and medium income earners, it is different what happens at the very top for the top 1% income earners. So the planned tax schedule of the Social Democrats and the Greens will increase the tax burden for top income earners, while this group will disproportionately benefit from tax cuts proposed by the Conservative Party. So they will actually decrease the income tax burden for the top 1%, while the Social Democrats and Greens plan to increase the top tax income burden. And then importantly, as is also discussed in the United States, famously put forward again by AOC at the Met Gala, let's tax the rich, the Social Democrats and Greens and the left want to reintroduce a wealth tax that has been abolished in Germany in 1997. So the Greens and the SPD, the Social Democrats, have very similar plans to introduce a 1% wealth tax on assets exceeding 2 million euro. And the left is even more extreme in their plans. They want to tax assets of 1 million euros with 5% and then increase this tax rates to up to 30% for very high levels of wealth. As I said, Germany introduced a minimum wage in 2015 for the first time. And the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the left all agree that they want to increase this minimum wage to 12% per hour. That's the proposition of the Social Democrats and the Greens. and to 30 euros per hour, which is the proposition of the left. In contrast, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party argue that wages should be negotiated between employers and employees, holding up the corporate tradition in Germany since the 1920s. So also this minimum wage and wealth tax and income taxation you have seen are quite heterogeneous programs between the two potential coalition partners. On the one hand, the Social Democratic Party and the left, and on the other hand, the Conservative Party and the Liberals, with the Greens being more prone to the left parties. So finally, we also have to mention pensions, of course. Stabilizing public pensions or expanding capital-funded retirement plans for the rapidly aging German population has been an important matter of any discussions in the past months. As I already said, 40% of the German electorate are older than 60, so every party has to address this part of electorate. Both the Greens and the Social Democrats want to have a minimum mandatory level of 48% of salaries, and the Left Party wants to even introduce a solidarity minimum pension of 1,200 euros. In contrast, the Conservative election program only includes a somewhat vaguely defined guaranteed pension and makes no commitment to pegging pensions to an average income. And what was quite prominently discussed, the Liberals want to introduce a new statutory equity pension that is more close to what people have in Sweden, or maybe also to some extent in the US within the same year. So one idea is to introduce a more capital-based funded pensions, which favors the Liberal Party. So I'm also very excited to see what comes out on Sunday, and I guess the Green Party has a big role to play if they eventually give up some of their ideas they laid out in their election programs and want to go with the CDU or the Liberals, or if they go with the Social Democrats or the Left Party. But as I said, mentioning all these different items of the election programs, their election program seems to be rather similar to what the Social Democrats and the Left Party proposed, and quite contrasting with the propositions of the Conservative and the Liberal Party, in fact. But we'll see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll turn now to Thomas Berger.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, and I'm delighted to join our colleagues from both Germany and from here at BU and at home in Boston for this discussion. I think, as the Consul General already pointed out, the initial impression is that foreign policy was not a big issue in the electoral campaign. And in many ways, the news is that there is not that much news, but that itself tells us a lot, I would suggest. And just briefly to sort of cut to the chase, and I won't try to go on too long about this, from the American-US point of view, this is both good news and bad news, and I'll explain why in a minute. But in any case, looking at the election campaign, I sort of looked at three, like a good political scientist, I sometimes pretend I am, three data points. I went and took a look at the party programs. So I wanted to see what the different political parties, all six of them, were saying about foreign policy. Then I followed the debates a little bit in the press. Germany also has marvelous news shows, and there was a lot to watch on YouTube and elsewhere in terms of debates. There were triple debates and quadruple debates going on for absolutely hours, and I was astonished at the, shall we say, the sheer endurance of the German public to take in even a fraction of all of this. And then finally, it was also interesting to take a look at how public opinion, both in terms of public opinion polls and in terms of published opinion, that is editorials and so forth, were responding to the debate. Now, when you take a look at the public, if you take a look at the party programs, Yes, precisely as the Consul General says, there is a consensus among the and the Alternative für Deutschland, the far-right nationalist populist party, have very different points of view. But all of the major parties recognize the importance and centrality of the EU to German foreign policy. All of them recognize NATO. All of them are emphasizing a global cooperation. So lots of similarity. If you actually take a look though at the tone and the language, there's significant differences between the CDU and then the SPD and the Social Democrats, and those reflect traditional positions. There are significant differences at one look. If you take a look at the actual debate, there was an initial outpouring of discussion in the spring and early summer, over security issues and over foreign policy issues in general. And it was quite interesting, especially when the US General David Petraeus, former commander of US forces in Afghanistan and in the former Yugoslavia, asked quite directly the candidates, what would you do if the United States were to ask you and NATO were to ask you to participate in overseas missions, something which we hope will not be likely, but is not to be ruled out. And all of the candidates immediately basically kind of froze up and had a great deal of difficulty answering that question. And then after that initial outpouring of discussion, which we had also about China and Russia, relations with China and Russia, things became more quiet. And we had a German commentary it's almost as if we were having this debate without any reference to the outside world at all. Until at the very end, we just had another debate where we had some more discussions. If you take a look at the German public response, there's been very little sign that the German public has been interested in bringing foreign policy into the discussion. And the reason that the German politicians are avoiding it is because it's an issue which they don't think is going to win them many points with the voters, and in fact, may in fact lose them votes if they mishandle it. There is an invisible tug of foreign policy in terms of the possibilities for coalition building. And one of the things which we're taking a look at, there are three most likely coalition possibilities right now. One would be and this is the one which right at this moment, if the polls are correct, is the most likely result, would be a so-called traffic light Ampelkoalition coalition. That would be one between the SPD, the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the FDP, the Free Democratic Party. Each one of their colors, each of these parties has a color which resembles that of the traffic light. So that's why it's called the traffic light coalition. But there are real problems, as Charlotte Bartels already pointed out. The FDP is not an easy partner for the SPD because of economic issues. And because of the tax policy, which both the Greens and the Social Democrats are pushing, it will be a tough sell for the leader of the Free Democrats, Christian Lindner, to bring his party on board. The other coalition, which is another major coalition, would be the Christian Democrats coming together with the Free Democrats and the Greens. This is called a Jamaica coalition because the party colors would be the same as the Jamaican national flag. In many ways, this would be easier to pull off in terms of the position of the parties, including on economic issues. But the Social Democrats are ahead, and traditionally, the party which has the largest number of votes usually gets to have the first shot at building a coalition. So this would make a lot of sense, but it will be difficult for Christian Lindner to bring his Free Democratic Party into a coalition which is talking about raising taxes on precisely the voters for the Free Democratic Party. The Free Democratic Party has sometimes been called the party of the how we call Wohlverdienende, is the German phrase, the better earners, a slogan that they learned to avoid very quickly. The third most likely coalition, however, is useful in this sense. This would be a coalition between the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the far left party, Die Linke, the red-green coalition. This is, in fact, what the CDU believes, the possibility of this is what the CDU believes has been giving them a last-minute surge in the polls. They believe that this is something which frightens a lot of middle-class voters in Germany because they're worried about this radical position. And one of the issues was that the left party, in addition to its socialist economic policy inclinations, also is a party for leaving NATO and for much closer cooperation with Russia. And this frightens the FDP, voting bloc. And to this extent that the red-red-green coalition looks like a possibility, it gives Christian Lindner, as the leader of the Free Democrats, political cover to go into a coalition with the Social Democrats and the Greens, which I still think is the most likely coalition. So there's a kind of invisible tug in which foreign policy plays an important role in the story. Now, I'll skip public opinion. What does this all mean for us? That is, for foreign policy more generally. Well, there are different issues. I think some of the other people, my colleague Vivian Schmidt will talk about the EU and their important questions there. In terms of the United States, the good news is Germany is not likely to be shifting its policy very much at all in foreign policy. We are going to see essential continuity almost regardless of whoever is in office. The bad news is we need more shifts. The United States believes that we are in a period where the world political system is shifting in very fundamental ways. And those issues will be issues where the German political leadership and whoever's going to be in power in Berlin in the next few, following these elections, will find difficult to deal with. In particular, the increasing tensions between the United States and the People's Republic of China over a wide range of issues. I'm also, by the way, director of Asian studies at BU and have been dealing with that a great deal. The possibility for real major conflicts emerging in the South China Seas and more importantly in connection with Taiwan is going to be moving the American political agenda. And this will be difficult for Germany to respond to, especially if it takes military dimensions. Even if it does not, the very strong agreement that almost all the parties have that China remains a critical partner, and Russia as well, a critical partner for dealing with such central issues, global governance issues as climate change and trade, will make it difficult for the United States to get Germany to cooperate with us the way we would like. I'm sorry to go on so long. I'll stop my comments at this point.
Thank you so much for that analysis. And now we will turn to Pascal König.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I want to, after having heard discussions on two very specific topics, policy domains, I want to take a broader perspective on the election. As we've already heard from the Consul General, this election will mark the end of an era because Angela Merkel will no longer be, will leave office. And what makes this somewhat special for this election is that it means the clearly most popular politician, who is the incumbent, who is Angela Merkel, is not up for re-election. So this is really not an election about voting against or for an incumbent, but it's really about voting for some of the candidates that are up for vote. But the German electoral system, German politics is not primarily about candidates. Of course, they play a very important role in politics and for elections, but German politics is much more party-centered than presidential system. So I want to kind of zoom out a bit and focus my remarks more on this larger party constellation, party conflict, party competition. And I hopefully can share my screen so I can give you some visuals as well. Hope you can see that. So what is kind of unusual about this election is not the overall structure of the party system, which is pretty much the same as at the last election, 2017. We have a party system that is structured by two main dimensions, an economic dimension, already mentioned by Charlotte, who's described major contrasts between the parties on that dimension. We have these left-wing parties, Left Party, SPD, Social Democrats, and the Green Party. And then we have parties with more market liberal positions. And there's this second dimension which is a kind of social cultural dimension about green environmental issues, alternative liberal versus a traditional authoritarian nationalist stance. What you can see about from this figure, but what is kind of unusual about this election is how the second dimension matters in this election. We've already heard a bit about this, and we'll probably hear more about this soon. It's the fact that while at the previous election, 2017, the dominant issue at this election was immigration and asylum. It was clearly towering all other issues, and that meant that it helped the right-wing populist party, AfD, to mobilize votes and to be quite strong, not just on the federal level, but also on the regional level at regional elections. And that situation has changed and makes it strategically very difficult for the right-wing populist party, because the whole immigration asylum issue has been kind of crowded out from the agenda. What has changed is that one other issue has moved to the top of the agenda. And it's not, as one might presume, the pandemic. It was for some months in 2020 and 2021, but September 2021, which is shown here in this chart, we see that environmental issues are the most important issue. So this is from the so-called Politbarometer source, asking people what is the most important problem, according to your opinion. And what we don't know is whether this is some kind of lip service. Do people just think that others think this is the most important problem? Or do they actually vote according to this issue saliency? And this will be of interest for the electoral outcome to see how strong the Green Party will be, which will profit the most from a strong or high salience of the environmental issue. The second aspect concerning this larger party space that you can see from this chart either is the overall fragmentation of the party system. And this is kind of unusual now from this election, but actually follows a larger trend that we have been observing throughout Europe and many other European countries. This election may well mark or herald a new era, also because it might be the end of the people's parties. Still, at the last election, we had one party, at least one party, with more than 30% vote shares. And if we can trust the most recent polls, it's quite sure that this will no longer be the case. So we will not have a party reaching even close to 30%. So that's very new. The party system is getting more fragmented. If you consider the so-called effective number of parties, it's a measure for the fragmentation of the party system. It has increased over the last 30 years. Consider that even still at the very beginning of the 1980s, Germany had a 2.5 party system. It was the Social Democrats, the CDU-CSU, and the FDP that you can see in this chart, kind of 2.5 parties, also according to the effective number of parties, if you calculate it. And at the 2017 election, we were close to 6 effective parties, counting also other parties competing at the election, not shown here. And at this election, following the recent polls, we will be close to 7 regarding the effective number of parties. So it's a stepwise increase, gradual increase in the fragmentation of the party system. And that, of course, makes politics maybe more interesting, but also makes coalition formation much more complicated. We've already heard about this. I'll try not to repeat what Thomas said. He's already pointed to, I guess, the really most important chunks here concerning coalition formation. I just want to kind of highlight some further aspects, which is something that one should be on the lookout for this Sunday. And I think one important point is whether there is a chance in terms of vote shares that there can be an SPD, Green Party, and left coalition. Not because it makes this coalition really more likely, but as Thomas already said, it really places the burden on the Liberal Party, because the Liberal Party has really warned against such a coalition and will be under extreme pressure to kind of prevent it. But that means that the small parties are also in a very difficult situation, because they have to negotiate with the larger parties, but also with other smaller parties. And it may ultimately not be the large parties, the CDU-CSU, and the SPD, who will be calling the shots, basically, because the whole coalition formation will also depend on the smaller parties kind of getting along with each other, perhaps finding ways to cooperate and to kind of play this game and playing the larger parties against each other. So this will become very complicated, I guess, next Sunday or after what follows after Sunday, regarding this whole issue of coalition formation. Okay, thank you very much. That's it from my side.
Thank you so much. And the next speaker will be Vivian Schmidt. Vivian.
So delighted to be on this panel and wonderful to hear all of the other interventions. So what I'm going to be doing is focusing on what the elections may mean for the EU. But I'm only going to be an EU policy, but I'm only going to consider this in terms of economic policy. As Thomas already said, on foreign policy, there's little that's likely to change. So if we think about Germany's role in Europe, it's been key over these past couple of decades, but it's often been called the reluctant hegemon because although it's had tremendous power, its past has made it reluctant to lead. This is certainly clear in terms of defense and security, but also generally in other areas, but not in economics. In the Eurozone crisis and the COVID-19 crises, Germany did exercise leadership, but interestingly, in very different directions. So if we take Germany and Chancellor Merkel in the Eurozone crisis, I think the Consul General is right that it ensured that Europe stayed together, but how it ensured this was problematic. Because Germany led the charge to reinforce the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact, or what I have called in my recent book, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone. This involved refusing to have any kind of mutual debt, which we now have with COVID, and with a story that essentially said that the problem was public debt and bad behavior, which it was in the case of Greece, rather than private debt and the structure of the euro, which was really true for everyone else. So what we saw was, it was the German finance minister, in fact, who led the charge to stop the fiscal stimulus following the financial crisis. And this meant that fiscal stimulus stopped much earlier than in the US. And what you also saw was enforcing austerity for all via a focus on reducing deficits and debts rapidly, rather than thinking of investment in growth. And it involved harsh austerity through very rapid deficit and debt reduction for countries in trouble, plus structural reforms often focused on deregulating labor markets and cutting the welfare state, mainly for countries in trouble. So the result was there was a double-digit recession, double dip recession, 2011, 2012, anemic growth for all, although things went much better for Northern Europe than for the South. But this was essentially bad news for the EU as a whole, given rising tensions between the North and the South. The North saying, we want stability and fiscal discipline, the South saying, we need solidarity. It also involved the politicization of EU institutions, as finance ministers from the North accused the Commission of playing politics and not enforcing the rules, as the European Parliament accused the Council and the Commission of causing a humanitarian crisis. And of course, we saw the rise of populist anti-system challenger parties across Europe. So that's the Eurozone crisis. However, we get a very important reversal with the COVID-19 crisis. And Germany and Chancellor Merkel were very much in the lead on this. And the COVID-19 crisis actually reverses some of the worst policies of the Eurozone crisis. Like all other countries, Germany immediately spent way above the limits of the Stability and Growth Pact, and was very happy that the Commission followed all of this by suspending the rules of that pact, as well as state aid rules. And importantly, and this is really important, Germany, after an initial moment where it seemed to agree with the Frugal Four, at each country together, they propose a recovery fund of 500 billion euros in grants that's increased by the Commission to 750 grants and loans, et cetera. So this is really an important moment with Germany exercising incredibly positive leadership. So you might ask, why did Merkel change her mind? So there are those who argue it's enlightened self-interest, that this is about the interdependence of the Eurozone economy, and Bavarian automakers who pushed and said that if our Italian suppliers across the border don't get relief, then we're all going down the tubes. But you could also argue, and I think very effectively, this is Merkel's humanitarian impulse, as we already heard from the Consul General. We saw it with the shift out of nuclear power, and we also saw it with the welcome to 1 million Syrian refugees, tremendously important. You could also say that this was about the concerns about the rise of populism and also Italian feelings of betrayal. But of course, it's also concerns about the future of the EU if nothing was done. And so importantly, all of this set the EU on a very promising path in which the Resilience and Recovery Fund and Next Generation EU made a shift, a major shift, to investing in the green transition, in the digital transformation, and addressing social inequalities. And it also provided a new role for the state in industrial strategy, with investment in growth, a shift away from the obsession with debt, which has been a German but also a Northern European focus. But of course, we're at a moment, we're really a tipping point, a tremendously important moment. More is to be done. The Resilience and Recovery Fund is only temporary. The push for investment is only beginning. The dangers of climate change continue to be pressing. The digital divide is widening and social inequality is rising. So what next? This is why the elections are so important for the future of the EU, and the hopes or promises for a more robust EU going forward. And of course, here, what the coalitions are tremendously important. If we look at the CDU on economic policy, Armin Laschet has repeatedly said that the pandemic relief fund should be temporary, that he wants to go back to the Stability and Growth Pact rules when the general escape clause is removed, and agrees with the Frugal Four countries, joined by other Central and Eastern European countries, on enforcing the old rules that no longer work in any case, given increases in deficits and debt. So what about the SPD? Schultz, interestingly enough, has said that you don't need to change the Stability and Growth Pact rules because it's all flexible enough. And in fact, arguably it is. You know, in any case, almost impossible to change these rules. The numbers and the rules are all over the treaties, and the political divisions are such between North and South, East and West, that nothing really is going to happen there. It would be a waste of time to try to spend all the political capital on changing the rules. And in fact, reinterpretation of the rules has been going on since 2013-14. So the real question is, how much does one reinterpret the rules and what does one do? We've already heard the SPD is pro-investment. It sees a new role for the state as entrepreneurial, and is likely to want to do much more on social equity issues and inequalities, plus is very much pro-greening the economy. So those are the two main parties. What coalition will determine the fate of the EU? The FDP is opposed to making the fund permanent, wants a strict enforcement of the rules, is intransigent on fiscal matters, and is very difficult to deal with, as we've already heard. The Greens are pro-permanent pandemic fund to ensure more spending on greening the economy, and prefers a coalition with the SPD. Die Linke, which we've already heard, may be toxic for any alliance. Nonetheless, it's very much pro a permanent pandemic fund, and if anything, is supportive of all the kinds of initiatives that would make the EU stronger. So CDU with FPD and Greens. The SPD reassured the markets as the financial minister said that Germany would stand behind Greece. But once the FDP came in after the elections, there was a much harder line. And this may help explain why you ended up to the sort of reinforcement of the rules and a strong no shared debt stance. SPD with the Greens and the FDP, good for Europe, but not great because of everything I just said about the FDP. And finally, SPD with the Greens and Die Linke, great for Europe, but maybe not for Germany. That would be the question in terms of all of the political divides, and I should stop here.
Thank you so much. And our last speaker in this first round of interventions is Sabine von Mering. And so please.
All right. I'm gonna show you a few pictures as well to liven it up a bit. I thought that for those who actually don't follow German politics, it would be helpful to actually see these faces that you've been hearing about. So here's Olaf Scholz at the top from the SPD, the most likely next German chancellor at the moment, judging by the polls. Armin Laschet, the one who was following Angela Merkel in her party with his kind of Mephisto-like looking in this picture, Markus Söder from the CSU in Bavaria, which is a party that unionizes unions with the CDU. Then Annalena Baerberg from the Greens, Christian Lindner from the FDP, which is called the Liberals, but these are not the liberals that we have here in America when we talk about liberals. And then, of course, the two ladies here on the far left, far right, are on the far left. So I wanted to talk about climate as a major concern in this election. As you know, today is the global climate strike. There wasn't one last year, but 2 years ago, 4 million people went to the streets, and Germany itself, I think, had over 1 million last time. So it was a huge event, and that is the case today. I just looked, they're claiming 100,000 people just in Berlin alone. There were over 470 events all over Germany in different cities. And as you can see here, they even got the Fridays for Future star Greta Thunberg to march with them in Berlin today. And she also spoke in front of the Brandenburg Gate. And the video is not allowing me to be shown, but that's okay because you can imagine what she would have said. What I liked was that she actually said Dankeschön in German. There is a climate strike here in Boston as well at 3 p.m. starting at the Public Garden. So if you're nearby, come on out. I'm certainly heading out there with my students later today. The climate policies of Germany are, of course, embedded, and that's important to remember because the Kyoto Protocol and all the European Union laws regarding climate are binding laws. That means when Germany almost missed its targets in 2020, they actually would have been fined if they hadn't followed. If the pandemic hadn't hit and therefore reduced emissions by 7%, and that helped them actually meet the targets. So if they hadn't met the targets, they would have been fined $300 million. So the internal European agreements on climate are binding, as opposed to the Paris Agreement, of course, which does not have teeth in that regard. It does not have penalties for non-compliance. There people are hoping to have this ambition mechanism, as you see here on the bottom, where there's a global stock take every 5 years. And we're, of course, looking forward to the stock take in Glasgow this November, where the United States will be participating again, thanks to rejoining the Paris Agreement this year under President Biden. As we already heard, climate change ranked at the top of Germans' concerns, with 36%, according to this story, selecting it as their main worry, right? Which is also, of course, climbing as a result of recent events. And as we saw in Pascal König's presentation, that is really a change from 4 years ago. One of the most powerful events, of course, was this summer's flooding in West Germany, which killed 200 people and devastated an entire region. And another concern is also that Germany is already has already warmed more than 1.5 degrees. So if you look at the Paris Agreement aiming for a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, well, Germany, that is a global average. Germany has already reached that. And in some regions here, as you can see in this map, it is like in Hamburg, for example, warming has already reached 1.7 degrees Celsius. So the concern, the repercussions of the climate crisis are felt on the ground. Although Germany is known worldwide and has been very good at claiming this climate leadership role, it is also still one of the largest exporters of lignite coal. And so this is something that doesn't really match. And I think one of the ambitions of the next government will have to be to actually match the image with the actions. And as you saw, I don't have to go over this because we already saw much nicer calculations, but the Greens have a pretty high likelihood of being part of a coalition government after this weekend, this one being the most likely one. And I should add that the only reason why there are only 3 chancellor candidates and not more, even though there are more parties, is that the other parties did not think they had a shot at putting up a chancellor. The Greens in May actually were ahead of the CDU and had the highest poll numbers, and so they could claim to have a shot at presenting the chancellor. The government, the current coalition government, of course, has set things in the direction of climate policy by putting out a climate protection law last year in 2019, and that was very much also influenced by these large mobilizations in the streets. But as we know, they were sued because the targets were not ambitious enough, and the court actually gave them gave the plaintiffs right. So the government had to up its targets, which is helpful for the coming government, because there is now a more stringent and more ambitious climate law. And as a consequence, I think you see the word climate being named everywhere in all party programs. The AfD is the only party in Germany that actually denies climate change and claims that it is beneficial. But the other parties are all supporting the idea that climate needs to be taken care of. And so if you want to compare the parties based on their ambitions with regards to the climate crisis, there are some significant differences. This is a little generalized. I would say it's more complicated than this, but as you can see, a climate neutrality, there are different levels of ambition as to by when climate neutrality should be reached. The current law makes it 2045. So, even though the left and the Greens want a more ambitious target, that shouldn't be so difficult to find agreement on. The exit from coal is also something that is agreed upon, but left and the Greens want to do a much faster exit from coal for the reasons that I just stated. And but in many other respects, expanding renewable energies, continuing the nuclear phase out, the reliance on train instead of primarily EVs, which seems to be the case here in the United States. Mobility transition is all about EVs. In Germany, all parties, even including the AfD, want to invest more in public transit and the train system. And then you have greater differences in terms of whether to ban diesel cars, whether to exit the combustion vehicle at a certain time, even though that I would say will come because all other countries around the world are now coming up with targets like that. So another, of course, sensitive topic is the speed limit on the Autobahn, which some like very much and others hate. And carbon pricing is also, even though it says here that the FDP wants carbon pricing, the carbon pricing that the FDP wants is not compatible with what the Greens want. So there would be a big negotiation happening. Emissions trading from the EU is not currently effective enough. So there's going to be negotiations about that. Agriculture is going to be a big part, where if the FDP and the Greens are in one coalition, then they really have to fight it out on that one. So my expectation is that there will be long negotiations, possibly we won't have a government possibly this calendar year. And I think I'll stop there just to show you that ambition is not enough. We do actually need to get to zero on these targets. So
thank you so much. So for the last 11 minutes of our webinar, I am going to invite the speakers to respond with a brief comment, either in response to their fellow panelists and any reflections that they've thought about for the last hour, or we have two audience questions that are quite good, and I'm just going to summarize them. One was, can we rule out a grand coalition? Is that something that is unlikely or likely? Comment on that. And also a question about the fragmentation of the parties. Is that a bad thing for German democracy? Is it destabilizing? So the panelists don't have to respond to that, but I just wanted to make sure that there was a chance. And I wanted to start with Consul General Menzenbach, please.
Thank you so much, Kaija. Thank you to all my colleagues here at the round table. There's a huge knowledge about German politics, so I'm delighted. So thank you so much. I have just a very small remark or comment to the point from Thomas Berger remarks. So you have said that the candidates for the Chancellor, all the three, were frozen after they were asked about sending troops abroad. So I can imagine this was because it's not a decision by the Chancellor, it's a decision by the Parliament. So the Chancellor, they can't say anything about it. So we have so to say, a Parlamentsarmee, so army of the Parliament. So I think most likely this was the reason, but I'm not sure. I didn't see this. So regarding these two questions, yeah, since I'm representing the German government, I can't comment on this question. Maybe Charlotte or Pascal from Germany, maybe they can say something about it or comment this, but I can't. But thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure and great fun. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try to take a stab at the questions, and I would like to combine them, because the funny thing is, of course, that they are not grand anymore, and therefore the grand coalition is no longer grand, right? Because we have this sort of more boutique style a la carte situation where everyone can find a party that is closer to their heart. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, as long as, because we have these kinds of coalitions of multiple parties at the state level for many, many years, and they are quite productive and successful. In fact, I think it is less of a paralyzing situation as we have here, where we only have two parties, and that when they sort of, lock down in their opposition, then nothing gets done. Whereas in Germany, the coalition has to come up with something, and the coalition negotiations last time in 2017 failed to come up with the Jamaica government because the FDP was not flexible enough. So I'm not happy with the fact that the FDP is going to play such a big role again, because they don't really, in my eyes, stand for anything, and they have kind of the least detailed program, but I think it's not a problem for democracy. It's actually a benefit in my eyes, and I'm excited to see what happens in the next few months.
Well, I'm not sure whether I'm going out of order, but the questions are very good. And let me just simply say that the historical experience, all the way going back to the 60s when we had a grand coalition, is that when you have the two major parties coming together, it encourages protest votes to develop both on the far left and the right. And that experience was, how we say, reaffirmed by the recent grand coalition. I think the SPD in particular, the Social Democrats, were really kind of beaten up by their whole experience, both before but also after. And the SPD, and I think a grand coalition would again push the SPD in a situation where this party, which desperately needs to reconnect with its historical base. This goes back to the point that Pascal König was making, that we seem to be seeing the end of a rather stable system of two major Volksparteien, center-left and center-right parties. We seem to be seeing that disappearing. Well, both the SPD and the CDU naturally want to avoid that situation. And going back to a grand coalition will make it difficult to stabilize German politics. Now, all the way back in the 1990s, when I first, and I only periodically dabble in German politics, but back in the 1990s, there was a lot of discussion among political scientists about the Weimarization of German party landscape, right? We've seen this proliferation of parties. And post-war Germany was in many ways founded as a rejection of the Weimar experience. And the Germans built a marvelous political system, which I describe sometimes to my students as the Mercedes-Benz of political systems. I mean, this powerful, stable, beautiful, sleek machine, which has been pretty effective in terms of producing policy. The question is, when you start having this multiplicity of parties, will it be possible for this machine, which is really designed and based upon consensus building at the top level, will that machine begin to sputter? And up to recently, I thought, nope, I was wrong. That whole hypothesis is wrong. We've had a proliferation of parties, and we haven't had that problem. This coming coalition will be, from a political point of view, a test, because my guess is that it's likely that the FDP will be in power. It will be likely that the position that they will insist upon is the finance ministry, right? And in that position, they may very well create real pressures. And the place where I think is most dangerous, and let me just circle to Vivian Schmidt, the place which potentially might be what in German would be called Sprengstoff for the coalition, that is a potential point where things can explode, will be exactly in the area of European politics. It's an area where they so badly need to have movement forward. I think Merkel stayed in office. She could have stepped down earlier. She stayed in office, I've been told, primarily in order to try to push forward movement in the European Union, and she succeeded in doing that. But this may now be a real test, both from a political science point of view and from sort of the on-the-ground watching German politics develop. So a lot to watch in the next few weeks and months.
It's time for me to jump in and agree with Thomas wholeheartedly. The real danger, as I see it, would be the FDP, in particular in charge of the finance ministry. That is problematic for Germany itself in terms of the green transition, in terms of spending, what it needs to do in terms of a view of the state that takes a more entrepreneurial role, which is very much what Scholz wants it to do, and the Greens. And of course, for the EU, it's a nightmare, because then you'll see in the Council of Ministers and Finance Ministers a real blockage to a permanent fund, to forward movement on all grounds. So, I mean, for that, in response to the first question, no, I actually do not rule out a grand coalition, but this time with the SPD in charge, which would actually make for a difference. But also, following what Thomas said, there is a problem with these grand coalitions. That has helped explain the rise of populism on both the extremes of the left and the right, because there's no differentiation or no seeming clear, transparent differentiation of the positions. And it seems to me that this is a moment when we need a clear political definite positions. And for this reason alone, I would say I would prefer a red-red-green coalition. The question would be, is Germany ready for this? But there's another issue, and that is with the more general question about proportional representation. And I think this is not such a problem. The real issue is that Germany is a kind of compound polity. It's got different federal institutions with relative independence, and no one actually knows who's in charge. This is okay so long as the German public as a whole trust in the system as a whole. And so the long as they're satisfied with both policy and politics. And that's where, again, what the new coalition is will become a big issue. If there's an FDP that really puts the brakes on forward movement in all sorts of areas, including greening the economy and addressing inequalities, I think that one might see increasing disruption, protest, and moving more to the extremes of the left and the right. If, however, you get a coalition that actually responds to what are clear citizens' concerns about green, about digital, about inequalities, and also about the EU, then things will probably be okay. I'll stop there.
I know I said I would end at 1:15, but I want to make sure that our two researchers from Harvard have at least 1 minute each to speak. So we are going to end at 1:17.
Okay, just briefly comment a bit more on this Weimarization of politics in Germany, since Thomas Berger already remarked on that. And I would add that we can't really compare the situation, because first of all, the economic situation is very different, and as Thomas remarked, the political system is a very different one, and it's one where is much better at avoiding kind of gridlock that we saw in Weimar. However, we do see this higher fragmentation of the party system, and if for this panel I've calculated the effective number of parties from 1928, and the last election before things went like really south. And the effective number of parties from 1928 is not much higher than the effective number of parties that we will probably have for the next legislature. And what this means is that the governments in the future, and at least after this next election, will become more heterogeneous. And that, like with grand coalitions, can be a problem, because you have to find more compromise between very different partners. And we have seen that on the regional level, especially in East Germany, where parties were forced to go into alliances that they never wanted to have in that form, simply to keep out the right-wing populist party and to have some kind of government at all. So we do see certain developments that are reminiscent of Weimar, but one has to be very careful with these comparisons.
Thank you. So maybe let me conclude with a very different aspect, coming back to what I said in the beginning about the domestic policies. So I think that it will be really interesting for the US to look what is happening in Germany, also from a domestic policy point of view, given that there is a lot of empirical evidence being produced internationally on what different social policies and taxes eventually do for an economy, for the distribution of economic resources within the population. But in fact, it seems to be very different from what is optimally from a social economic point of view to what is politically feasible. So given that a lot of parties have proposed to have a wealth tax again in Germany, and this is also a proposition running in the US, I think it's really interesting to follow up what is going to happen if eventually more left-wing parties form a government, if eventually introducing a wealth tax will be feasible in Germany. So I think it's a really interesting case what we'll see in the next months. Also, yeah, with respect to domestic policies that are internationally discussed, given that we have seen rising inequality in our many countries, particularly in the US and in Germany.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to have been able to learn and listen to this superb panel today. And I wanted to thank the Consul General for joining us and for our guest researchers from Harvard and also my colleagues. So thank you so much to all of the panelists.